the question that I was asked was to reflect on terms of the importance of terminology. And it reminded me of a trip to India when I was a PhD student, and on a Saturday morning in the National Archives of India, an archivist asked me if I was Indian, and I said no, and he said like, "You look Indian," and I said like, "Well, you look kind of Mexican," and and he did not accept this answer, and he was like, "Well, but you have Indian blood, and that is a complicated question." It was like he was very certain, like, "But you must have Indian blood," and for a Mexican, that's a complicated question, particularly like because my father comes from a Tepehuan community in Durango, and I never identified as a mestizo. I never identified as a Tepehuan, which is a privilege that people have. But when I say like we don't use like the term Indio anymore, it's pejorative. But to get out of this situation, I said like, well, yes, but it's not like the type of Indian blood that you're thinking of. And he looked at me. He looked at me and he said like very glad. He said like I knew it. And he was like he was, he was like I knew it, and I was like, okay, we have not learned anything about like this sort of like conversation. Uh, but okay, let me start. So for me, that kind of like is the importance of ideas and history of ideas, because they terms repeat themselves in different contexts. They repeat themselves and have different meanings at a time, at different times. So I'm mostly interested in the history of ideas from the global south, and in particular, my work has been on the question of untouchability. And untouchability is most in time has mostly seen as a religious term. But my argument in my book is that untouchability in the 20th century became a political term that had to do was related to issues of rights and questions also of race. So today I'm going to focus a little bit in how anthropologists, and particularly because we are academics, how anthropologists and how sociologists in India started to mesh this question of race with that of caste. And this is particularly important because Humeira yesterday mentioned the Durban conference, in which Dalits used the question of race to make a point about their rights across the world. And when that happened, it was sociologists, people like Andre Betel, that said like race does not have anything to do with caste. And my point is that if we look at the history of ideas about race and caste, we'll see that it was Indian sociologists and Indian anthropologists that were making this point before Dalits themselves. So my point comes from the works of B.R. Ambedkar, but also like people like Stuart Hall that have mentioned how race, the meaning of race, have shifted over time. And it really has not disappeared, but it has transformed now into questions of DNA, genetics, and so on, that sort of like hide these ideas. And like in Latin America, the question of racial mixing has also changed the way it's been looked. In India, before we had like a formal sort of like empire, there was a lot of racial mixing. And this is where people like the Bibis, the white Nawabs, the Aryo-Asians, the Anglo-Indian communities sort of appear, and they were sort of like accepted, and their status started to change once scientific racism and segregation became formalized. So I apologize to all my Saudatians because this is partly very simple and a bad explanation of caste, but this will help me to make my point across. And I was thinking yesterday about what Mara Viveros was showing us with the Pintura de Castas. And what I wanted to show here is that sort of like classification of ideas, of people, also work. And if you don't know anything about caste, this is just like a very simple example of what I'm talking about. There are many interpretations of caste. We could discuss jati, we could discuss other type of subdivisions. But what I want you to see is that in this Varna system, like we have sort of like a pyramid structure in which Brahmins are at the top and Dalits are at the bottom. They're not even part of that system, but they are kind of like the outcasts of like or formerly used to be called untouchables, and that had like a hierarchy of value. And why is this important? Because in the 20th century, Dalits became a political problem for the nationalist movement that was looking independence, because the British were saying we need to protect the untouchables from the Hindus themselves. And if you don't know anything about India, I know like you have heard about Gandhi. And my point is not like to dismiss Gandhi entirely, but it's to show you how the Gandhi sort of like, or what was like some of the common language that people used to refer to untouchables. Here he's talking about the needs and the ways and the possibilities of Dalits to understand politics and to understand their own needs. And what I want to highlight is that Gandhi at some point, he says, the dumb millions, Dalits used to be referred as mute because they couldn't talk like this political language. They don't know what they want or what they need. They are living corpses. So we need to tell them what they want to feel. We need to tell them what are their political interests. And the reason the Dalits are so important is because back then there was like 60 million people, 60 million Dalits. Today there's closely around 200 million people. And the connections that people have made about race and caste today, particularly activists, is to connect someone like Ambedkar, the person that I studied, who was a Dalit leader, the person that sort of like claimed to represent Dalits and who really put like the question of untouchability into a national scope beyond regional sort of like divisions. He, when partition was about to come, he wrote Du Bois to have like these exchanges of saying like, we are oppressed people. I need to sort of, I want to go to the UN and I need your help to make my point across. And that is important, but my point is that race is so complicated, caste is so complicated, that at the same time Ambedkar was writing to Du Bois, he was also writing to Churchill to say, you need to stop independence. And Churchill, which we know has never been called an anti-racist, he says, well, we need to protect the untouchables from the Brahmins, and we need to sort of like, based on the Declaration of American Independence, like we need to stop all of this happening. So my point is that ideas matter, the context matters, and the period that I'm talking about is basically the 1920s. And what is going on around the world is people in Latin America are thinking about impurity. People in South Africa are thinking about impurity. As you mentioned in your talk, like the question of who mixes with who is really important. So just to give you kind of like a panorama of what was going on in the States, in Britain, the question of impurity, of racial mixing was considered to be a door to degeneration. So all these languages and ideas are being discussed at this time. They have different imperial connections, so there's a lot of the times there are no crossings, but they are happening at the same time. And a lot of those ideas came from academics. So in India, just to go very quickly, we have, and I'm going to rush, like I'm going to go really quickly with the question of British Empire. But we start to see in the 19th century a division between the rulers and the ruled. And there starts to be a justification of why Europeans are different than Indians. And for us, and a very important term is like the Aryan term, because it is in the 19th century where the British start to produce ideas about races in India, even though there's a lot of caste discussions as well. People like Risley and so many others are discussing what are the implications of ruling a place like India that has so many pure races. So we have martial races, we have criminal tribes that are considered to be dangerous by criminal, like not born criminals. We have caste and tribes, and the British are trying to decode all these characteristics. So in this particular narrative, I pay special attention to someone like Risley, because he is the one that sort of like makes the most direct link of race and caste. He was influenced by anthropometry and the work of US anthropometrists like Samuel Morton, and French Paul Broca and Topinard. And he wanted to confirm that the upper castes were closer to Europeans and the lower castes had like an indigenous background that was closer to sort of a black African background. So one of his main ideas is to say that we are able to collaborate with the Brahmins because there is a connection between Europe and the Brahmins. And finally, he makes this point of that the lower caste people, the untouchables, are at the bottom of society because they don't share this background. So the implications of this theory is that it fixes categories. It's only focusing on Barna. It's not really complex. It's something that British people, British rulers in Britain can understand. And it justifies this colonial rule. But what happens in India? The Indian sociologists and Indian anthropologists, the founders of these disciplines, do not reject this quite at all. Someone like G.S. Gurye would refer to people to tribes as backward Hindus. And even though he sort of like pushed back a little bit about the questions of race, he still maintains that the Brahmins have kept themselves away from mixing with other people, which meant they have more of a European blood, like they were still pure. And this, the work of people like Gurye and Radha Kamal Mukherjee is not because they don't believe racism is bad. Some of them, they had like this contention, but the language of race was scientific and it was a fact that people could not dismiss entirely. So they make these sort of like strange arguments about it. Radha Kamal Mukherjee was not, he idealized caste rather, and said like untouchables are really happy even though if they're oppressed because they have a place in the community. D.N. Majumdar, he was more straightforward about it, and he says, well, there are different races and caste sort of like prevents these racial wars that we see going on in Europe and in America. So what is the answer for that? They are making the connection that race is caste. Someone like Ambedkar is interesting to me because he studied at Columbia University under the students of Franz Boas, particularly Alexander Goldenweiser. And he sort of like moves around the question of race by bringing race as culture. And it's interesting because Manuel Gamio, Gilberto Freire, that are also sort of super controversial and racist, they come up with different answers around this time. So Ambedkar started to write about race and caste early since he was in Colombia. And his point was that to make this notion that there is no such connection. So even though today there are people that make these connections, he's dismissing this connection as something that does not to be considered. In Ambedkar's sort of most famous text, Annihilation of Caste, he makes this pretty explicit. He says everyone in India is mixed. We need to sort of forget about this idea that there are pure races. Like everyone, if there's a Brahmin in the north, they are the same racially as the Dalits in the north. If there are Brahmins in the south, they're exactly the same as the Dalits in the south. So caste system does not demarcate racial division. And this was important for Ambedkar because if you were considered to be indigenous at that time, it meant that you have to be isolated politically. You did not have a claim to political rights. So what does he do? He turns into Buddhism and says Dalits have been considered untouchables because we refuse to submit to Hinduism. This is like a cultural and a social and a historical explanation to their subjection. And just to finish, even though Ambedkar made this point across several decades ago, nowadays, this notion of this racial difference it's being more complicated. Dalits are making these connections in an anti-racist way, which is good. but even Ambedkar had like his reservations because he could not dismiss race entirely. So even when he referred to Adivasis or scheduled tribes, he was not certain that they were at the same level as Dalits. He considered that they might be racially different. So to conclude, this question of that I wanted to make, that Humeira made yesterday, Dorvin, we need to understand the context, the time. And finally, there was a big controversy in India a few months back, maybe a year ago, about this notion of Brahmin genes. Like now it's coming up, this idea that Brahmins are different and that Brahmins are, well, not by everyone, of course, but a few sort of like select people are making this notion that Brahmins are racially different. They have different genes than Dalits. So I'm going to stop there and thank you.